If only I had gone with her. George Aros has said these words 10,000 times. July 1981. Sunrise High Sierra Camp, Yosemite. His daughter Stacy wanted to photograph the lake. Just a 10-minute walk. She asked him to join her. He refused, too tired. But something made him call out as she left. "Change your sandals. Wear your hiking boots." She obeyed. She disappeared anyway, vanished between the campsite and a man sitting on a rock 100 yards away. No body, no evidence. Just a father's eternal regret and one haunting question. What difference would those boots have made? George Aros was not a worried father by nature. He had raised Stacy to be independent, capable, smart. At 14, she was mature beyond her years, responsible, the kind of daughter who called when she'd be late, who studied without being told, who looked after her younger siblings without complaint. That's why on July 25, 1981, when she asked to take a short walk alone to photograph Sunrise Lake, he didn't hesitate. The campsite was full of people. The trail was clearly marked. It was still light outside. What could possibly go wrong? Everything, as it turned out. But George didn't know that yet. He was lying in the tent, his legs aching from 6 hours on horseback. The ride up from the valley floor had been brutal, climbing through switchbacks and rocky terrain until they reached the high country at nearly 9,000 feet elevation. He was 52 years old and feeling every year of it. When Stacy poked her head into the tent around 5:45, her camera hanging around her neck, her face flushed with excitement about the golden hour light on the lake, he made a decision he would regret for the rest of his life. "I'm too tired, honey. You go ahead." Those were his exact words. Stacy's face fell slightly, but she recovered quickly. She was used to her father's exhaustion. He worked long hours as a construction supervisor, often coming home too drained to play or talk. She understood. She always understood. That understanding would haunt George more than anything else. She never made him feel guilty, never complained, just smiled and said she'd be back in 20 minutes. But as she turned to leave, something stopped George. Later, he would describe it as a flutter in his chest, an unexplained anxiety that made him sit up. He called after her. "Stacy, wait! You're wearing sandals." She looked down at her feet, at the canvas sandals she'd slipped on after her shower. "So?" she asked. George couldn't explain why it mattered. The trail was well maintained. Other hikers wore sandals, but the feeling persisted. "Change into your hiking boots." The trail might be rough. Stacy rolled her eyes in that way only teenage girls can. But she came back and switched into her sturdy leather boots, the ones they'd bought specifically for this trip. She laced them up carefully, double-knotted them the way George had taught her. "Happy now, Dad?" she asked with a grin. He nodded. She left. He never saw her again. 20 minutes passed, then 30. George wasn't worried yet. Stacy was probably taking her time, getting the perfect shots. She was particular about her photography, often spending an hour on a single composition. At 45 minutes, he started to feel uneasy. At an hour, he walked out of the tent and scanned the area. The campsite was busy with other members of their riding group, 12 people total who had made the journey together. Most were relaxing after the long ride, preparing dinner, enjoying the mountain air. George approached Dorothy Chen, a woman from their group who had been sitting outside her tent with a clear view of the trail Stacy had taken. "Did you see Stacy come back?" George asked. Dorothy shook her head. "Haven't seen her since she left. But I did see Gerald go after her about 10 minutes later." George's heart rate picked up slightly. Gerald Stewart was the oldest member of their group, a 77-year-old retired postal worker from Sacramento who had befriended Stacy during the ride up. He was a kind man, gentle, always ready with a story or a joke. "Gerald went with her?" George asked. Dorothy pointed toward the trail. "He walked that way." I figured he was keeping an eye on her. This information should have comforted George, but it didn't. Something felt wrong. George walked quickly toward the trail, calling Stacy's name. No response. He walked faster, almost jogging now, ignoring the burning in his tired legs. About 100 yards from the campsite, he found Gerald Stewart sitting on a large boulder beside the trail, breathing heavily. The old man looked up as George approached, his weathered face concerned. "George," Gerald said, standing up with effort. "I was just about to come get you." The words made George's blood run cold. "Where's Stacy?" he demanded. Gerald pointed down the trail. "She went that way, toward the lake." "I tried to keep up with her, but my knees." He trailed off, looking guilty. "I sat down here to rest. Figured I'd wait for her to come back. But that was, God, maybe 40 minutes ago?" George didn't wait to hear more. He ran down the trail, calling his daughter's name over and over. The path was clear, well-defined, impossible to lose. On one side was dense forest, on the other a steep rocky slope leading down to the lake basin. Stacy should have been visible, should have heard him calling, but there was nothing, just the wind in the pines and the distant sound of water. George ran for 10 minutes straight until he reached the lake, his lungs burning in the thin mountain air. The shore was empty. No Stacy. No footprints in the sandy areas near the water. No sign anyone had been there at all. Panic set in fully now. George ran back up the trail, checking every side path, every cluster of trees, anywhere a person might have stepped off to take a photograph. Nothing. When he returned to the campsite, gasping and wild-eyed, the other members of the group gathered around him. "She's gone," George said, the words feeling unreal even as he spoke them. "Stacy's gone." Within minutes, the entire group mobilized. They split into pairs, covering every trail radiating from the camp. They called her name until their voices were hoarse. They searched until darkness made it impossible to continue. And then, at Dorothy Chen's insistence, someone rode down to alert the park rangers. What George didn't know yet was that this disappearance would become one of the most baffling cases in Yosemite's history. What he didn't know was that despite a massive search effort involving 150 people, trained tracking dogs, and helicopter overflights, almost no trace of his daughter would ever be found. And what he especially didn't know was that Gerald Stewart's story had a detail that didn't quite add up, a small inconsistency that would torment investigators for decades. The ranger station received the call at 9:47 p.m. By midnight, a preliminary search team had reached Sunrise High Sierra Camp. By dawn, the full operation was underway. Park Ranger Michael Torres led the effort, a 15-year veteran who had coordinated dozens of search and rescue operations. But from the beginning, something about this case bothered him. "Tell me again exactly what happened," he said to George, notebook in hand. George repeated the story, his voice mechanical from exhaustion and shock. When he got to the part about Gerald Stewart, Torres stopped him. "This man Gerald, he was sitting on a rock 100 yards from camp?" George nodded. "And he saw Stacy walk past him?" Another nod. Torres wrote something in his notebook, his expression troubled. Torres interviewed Gerald next. The old man was clearly shaken, wringing his hands as he spoke. "I wanted to walk with her," Gerald explained. "She's such a sweet girl, always talking to me during the ride, asking about my life. When I saw her leave camp, I thought I'd join her. Keep her company, you know? But I couldn't keep up. My knees are bad, had 2 replacements. So I sat down on that boulder to rest, figured I'd wait for her to come back." Torres asked the crucial question. "Did you see her walk past you? Did you see her continue down the trail beyond where you were sitting?" Gerald hesitated. "Well, I assume she did. I mean, where else would she have gone?" Torres underlined something in his notes. That hesitation was important. Here's what bothered Torres, what would bother everyone who examined this case. If Gerald was sitting on a rock 100 yards from camp and Stacy walked that direction, he should have seen her clearly. The trail was open, with good visibility, but Gerald never actually confirmed seeing her pass his position. He assumed she did because that was the only logical conclusion. But what if she didn't? What if something happened in that 100-yard gap between the campsite and Gerald's boulder? But what could have happened? The trail was in full view of the camp. Multiple people saw Stacy walking. Multiple people saw Gerald follow her. If something had occurred, someone would have seen or heard it, unless it happened in the one spot nobody was looking. Torres walked that section of trail repeatedly, studying every inch. About 40 yards from the camp, there was a slight bend where the trail curved around a large rock formation. For maybe 20 feet, that section was not visible from either the camp or from Gerald's boulder position. It was the only blind spot in the entire route. Torres stood in that spot, timing how long it would take to walk through it. 12 seconds. 12 seconds where Stacy would have been out of sight of everyone. Could someone have grabbed her in 12 seconds? Pulled her into the forest without making a sound? It seemed impossible, but Torres had learned that impossible things happened in the wilderness. The tracking dogs arrived on the second day. 2 German shepherds and their handlers, specialists in wilderness search and rescue. Torres watched as the handlers gave the dogs Stacy's scent from clothing in her tent. Both dogs immediately moved to the trail, following the path Stacy had taken. They tracked her scent to Gerald's boulder without hesitation. But beyond that point, something strange happened. The dogs circled, whined, sat down. They couldn't pick up the trail. One handler, a woman named Sarah Mendez with 20 years of experience, looked at Torres with confusion. "This doesn't make sense," she said. "The scent just stops. Like she vanished into air right here." Torres asked the question that was on everyone's mind. Could she have been carried? If someone picked her up, would that explain why the scent stops? Sarah shook her head slowly. The dogs would still track where the person carried her. They'd follow the scent through the air, along the route taken. But there's nothing. It's like she ceased to exist at this spot. She paused, then added quietly, "I've only seen this happen once before. In another wilderness disappearance. And we never found that person either." Torres felt a chill despite the warm July sun. This case was becoming more disturbing by the hour. The search expanded. Teams combed every inch of terrain within a 5-mile radius. They checked every cave, every crevice, every drainage that a person could fall into. The helicopter made grid pattern flights, the observer using binoculars to scan for any flash of color, any sign of Stacy's bright blue jacket or her blonde hair. Divers searched the lake, though nobody could explain how Stacy would have reached it without being seen. Nothing. On the 4th day, a searcher found something, a small object lying in the dirt about 15 feet off the trail, just past Gerald's boulder, right at the tree line. It was a black plastic lens cap from a camera. George identified it immediately. It belonged to Stacy's camera, a Nikon FM that he'd given her for her 13th birthday. She was religious about keeping the lens cap on when not shooting. The discovery should have been encouraging, proof that Stacy had made it past Gerald's position, evidence that she'd been where she said she was going. But Torres found it troubling instead. The lens cap was lying on bare ground, not hidden in grass or leaves. How had previous searchers missed it? And more importantly, why would Stacy remove her lens cap there, 15 feet into the trees? If she was photographing the lake, she'd have kept it on until reaching the shore. If she was photographing the forest, she'd have stayed on the trail for better light. Torres stood at the spot where the lens cap was found, trying to recreate the scene. Stacy walks past Gerald. She's heading to the lake. But something makes her step off the trail. Here. What? Torres scanned the forest. There was nothing remarkable about this spot. No scenic vista, no interesting rock formation, no wildflowers or wildlife that would attract a photographer. Just trees and shadows. So why did she step off the trail? Or did she? Torres considered another possibility. What if the lens cap fell off somewhere else, and someone or something moved it here? But that seemed even more far-fetched. The search continued for 11 days. 150 people dedicated themselves to finding Stacy Arras. The effort was extraordinary, exhaustive, professional. They left no stone unturned, no possibility unexplored, and they found absolutely nothing beyond that single lens cap. No torn clothing, no blood, no disturbed earth suggesting a struggle. No tracks leading away from the trail, no other personal items. It was as if Stacy had been plucked from existence by an invisible hand. On day 12, the search was officially called off. The probability of finding Stacy alive was now essentially zero. The probability of finding her at all seemed nearly as low. George Arras refused to leave. Even after the official search ended, even after the other members of his riding group returned to the valley and eventually to their homes, George remained at Sunrise High Sierra Camp. He walked the trails alone, calling Stacy's name. He barely slept, barely ate. Other campers reported seeing him at all hours, a haunted figure moving through the forest like a ghost himself. Park rangers had to forcibly escort him out after 2 weeks, worried he would become a victim himself. As they led him away, George kept looking back, as if expecting to see Stacy emerge from the trees, smiling and apologizing for worrying everyone. But Gerald Stewart's behavior was almost as concerning. The old man had become withdrawn, barely speaking to anyone after the second day of the search. When Torres tried to interview him again, pressing for more details about exactly what he saw and when, Gerald became agitated. "I told you everything," he insisted. "I sat on that rock. I rested. I assumed she walked past me. What more do you want?" Torres wanted a lot more. He wanted to know why Gerald had really followed Stacy. He wanted to know if Gerald's view of the trail had been as clear as he claimed. He wanted to know if there was anything at all, that Gerald wasn't saying, but Gerald provided nothing more. And without evidence, Torres couldn't push harder. 6 months later, Torres received a phone call. It was from a hiker named Robert Mills, who had been part of the group that passed Gerald on the trail that day. Torres remembered Mills from the initial interviews, a 34-year-old accountant from Los Angeles who had provided little useful information at the time. But now Mills had something to say, something that had been bothering him for months. "I need to tell you something about that day," Mills said, his voice uncertain. "About Gerald Stewart and what I saw." Torres grabbed his notebook. "I'm listening," he said. Mills explained that he and 3 friends had been hiking up from the lake when they encountered Gerald sitting on the boulder. Gerald had asked if they'd seen a young blonde girl. They said no, they hadn't passed anyone. But here's what Mills hadn't mentioned before. Gerald's reaction to that news was strange. Instead of seeming worried or alarmed, Gerald had seemed almost relieved. Mills couldn't quite put his finger on it, but Gerald's expression had shifted when they said they hadn't seen Stacy. From concern to something else, something Mills couldn't identify. "It's probably nothing," Mills said, "but it's been eating at me." The way he looked, it wasn't right. Torres thanked Mills and hung up. Then he pulled out the case file, which by now had grown to over 300 pages. He found Gerald Stewart's contact information and dialed. The phone rang 7 times before a woman answered. "Stewart residence," she said. Torres identified himself and asked to speak with Gerald. There was a long pause. "I'm sorry," the woman said, her voice breaking. "Gerald passed away 3 weeks ago, heart attack." Torres felt a mix of emotions, sympathy, frustration, and something else. Suspicion. He asked a few more questions. Gerald had been in good health for his age. The heart attack had been sudden, unexpected. He died alone in his study, slumped over his desk, found by his wife when she came home from shopping. "Was he writing something?" Torres asked, the question coming from pure instinct. The woman paused again. "Yes," she said slowly. There was a notebook open on his desk, but the pages were blank, like he'd been about to write something but never did. Or ... quote. She hesitated. Or like he'd torn out what he wrote. There were ragged edges in the binding. Torres felt his pulse quicken. "Did you find any torn out pages? In the trash anywhere?" The woman said no. Gerald's study had been clean. If he'd written something and torn it out, he'd disposed of it somewhere else, or taken it with him to his grave. The case went cold officially, but Torres never let it go. Every few months, he'd pull out the file and review it, looking for something he'd missed. In 1984, 3 years after Stacy's disappearance, Torres got a call from a forensic anthropologist working in a different part of Yosemite. Hikers had discovered human remains. Female, young. Torres felt his heart sink as he drove to the location. Could this finally be Stacy? But the remains were quickly identified through dental records as a different missing person, a woman who'd vanished in 1977. Stacy remained missing, remained a mystery. George Arras spiraled after Stacy's disappearance. His marriage collapsed within a year, the strain too much for him and his wife to bear together. They dealt with grief differently. She wanted to hold memorial services and find closure, while George refused to accept that Stacy was gone. He became obsessed with the case, convinced that answers existed if he could just find them. He returned to Yosemite every summer, hiking the same trails, interviewing anyone who would talk to him. He created elaborate theories about what might have happened, filling notebooks with diagrams and timelines and questions that had no answers. In 1986, 5 years after Stacy vanished, George sat down with Torres for what would be their final conversation. George looked 20 years older than his actual age, his hair completely gray his face deeply lined. "I know what you think," George said without preamble. "You think I'm crazy. Obsessed, but I can't let it go because I keep coming back to one thing." He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "The boots. Why did I tell her to change her boots?" Torres had wondered about this too. "You said you were worried about the trail," he offered. George shook his head violently. "But I didn't really think about the trail. It was instinct. Something made me call out to her. Some premonition. I don't believe in that stuff, but I can't explain it any other way." Torres chose his next words carefully. "George, even if she'd been wearing sandals, even if you'd gone with her, I don't think it would have changed anything. Whatever happened to Stacy, it happened fast and without warning. Nothing you could have done would have stopped it." George stared at him for a long moment, then asked the question that had been haunting him for 5 years. "Do you think Gerald did something to her?" Torres had asked himself this question 1,000 times. Gerald had opportunity. He'd been alone with knowledge of Stacy's location. He'd behaved oddly afterward, but there was no evidence, no motive, no history of violence. And Gerald was 77 years old, physically frail. How could he have overpowered and hidden a healthy 14-year-old girl without leaving any trace? "I think Gerald knew something he didn't tell us," Torres finally said. "I think maybe he saw something or heard something and for some reason chose not to share it. Maybe he thought it wasn't important. Maybe it scared him. Maybe he thought nobody would believe him. But do we think he hurt Stacy? Number. I don't think he was physically capable of it." George absorbed this, then asked, "So what do you think happened to my daughter?" Torres had never spoken his real theory out loud to anyone, but George deserved honesty. "I think someone else was on that trail that day. Someone we don't know about. Someone who wasn't part of the search group, wasn't part of the hiking group, wasn't camping at sunrise. Someone who was just there, in the wrong place at the wrong time, or the right place if they were hunting." The word hung in the air between them. Hunting. It implied predation, premeditation, evil. George's face went pale. "You mean someone was waiting for a victim, and Stacy just walked into it?" Torres nodded slowly. "The statistics support it. Most missing persons cases in national parks are either accidents, getting lost, or medical emergencies. But a small percentage, maybe 5%, are unexplained. And of those unexplained cases, there are patterns. Young people, fit and healthy, disappearing in good weather on clear trails, no bodies ever found. It's rare, but it happens." George stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "So my daughter was murdered by some random psychopath, and there's no evidence, no leads, nothing?" Torres wished he could offer something better, but he just nodded. George left that day and never returned to Yosemite, but he never stopped thinking about Stacy, never stopped replaying that moment when she asked him to come with her and he said no. He told people that he heard her voice sometimes, asking, "Dad, will you come with me?" over and over like a loop he couldn't break. In 1993, George Arras died of liver failure, his health destroyed by years of drinking. But before he died, he told his remaining children something he'd never shared before. On the night Stacy disappeared, after the initial search came up empty, George had walked back to that blind spot on the trail, the 20-foot section that wasn't visible from camp or from Gerald's boulder. He'd stood there in the dark and he'd felt something, a presence, a wrongness, like the forest itself was holding a terrible secret. He'd been too frightened to investigate further, too shocked by the events of the day. But he always wondered if he'd given up too soon, if he'd walked away from the answer. Dorothy Chen, the woman from the riding group who had seen both Stacy and Gerald leave the camp, carried her own burden of guilt. In an interview conducted in 1998, 17 years after the disappearance, Dorothy revealed something she'd never told investigators. She'd seen someone else that day. A man she didn't recognize, not part of their group, standing in the trees about 50 yards from the campsite, watching. She'd thought it was strange at the time, but hadn't mentioned it because it seemed unrelated. After all, Sunrise High Sierra Camp was a public area. Many hikers passed through, but after Stacy vanished, Dorothy became convinced that the man in the trees was significant. He was just standing there, she said in the interview, her voice still haunted after all those years. Not hiking, not doing anything, just watching our camp, watching the trail. And when I looked at him, he didn't look away or smile or wave like normal people do. He just kept staring. Dorothy tried to describe the man to the interviewer, but her memory had faded. He was tall, she thought, wearing dark clothing, maybe in his 30s or 40s, though she couldn't be sure. She hadn't seen his face clearly, and she had no idea if this man had anything to do with Stacy's disappearance. But she'd thought about him for 17 years, wondering if she'd witnessed something crucial and failed to recognize it. The interviewer asked why she hadn't reported this to the Rangers. Dorothy's answer was heartbreaking in its honesty. Because I didn't want to be responsible. If I told them about the man and it turned out to be nothing, I'd feel foolish. If I told them and it was something, I'd have to live with the fact that my information might have come too late. Either way, I lost. So I said nothing, and I've regretted it every single day since. The Stacey Arras case became something of a legend in the search and rescue community. It was taught in training courses as an example of a theoretically impossible disappearance. How could a person vanish so completely? Instructors used it to discuss the limits of search technology, the importance of immediate response, the psychological factors that affect witness testimony. But for those who had been there, who had searched those 11 days, it was more than a case study. It was a failure that haunted them. Sarah Mendez, the tracking dog handler, eventually left search and rescue work entirely. She told a friend that she couldn't shake the memory of her dog circling that spot on the trail, unable to find a scent, unable to do the one thing they'd been trained to do. They knew something was wrong, Sarah said. Dogs have instincts we don't understand. Mine were scared. I'd never seen them scared before. Over the years, various theories emerged about what happened to Stacey Arras. Some believed she'd been abducted by someone in a vehicle, though there were no roads accessible to that part of the trail. Others suggested she'd fallen into a hidden mine shaft or natural pit, though extensive ground-penetrating radar searches found nothing. A few people proposed that Stacey had run away voluntarily, though her family situation was stable and there was no evidence she was unhappy. The theory about a random predator gained the most traction among investigators, but without witnesses or physical evidence, it remained just a theory, and there were those who believed something else entirely, something that couldn't be easily explained or investigated. In 2003, a hiker reported finding what he thought was Stacey's camera near a remote area of Yosemite, miles from where she'd vanished. Rangers investigated, but the camera turned out to be a different brand and model, abandoned by a tourist years after Stacey's disappearance. The false lead was disappointing, but not surprising. Over the years, dozens of tips had come in, each one thoroughly checked, each one leading nowhere. People reported sightings of girls matching Stacey's description in various cities and states. A woman in Oregon was convinced Stacey was her neighbor. A man in Arizona claimed to have seen her working at a diner. Every lead was investigated. Every lead went cold. George Arras's other children grew up in the shadow of their missing sister. They learned to live with the absence, the not knowing, the terrible possibility that they might never have answers. They held no memorial service because they couldn't agree on whether it was appropriate without a body. They marked Stacey's birthday every year, but as time passed, it became more painful than comforting. Eventually, they stopped. Life moved forward because it had to, even though a piece of their family was frozen in time, forever 14, forever walking toward a lake she'd never reach. The Sunrise High Sierra Camp still operates, welcoming hikers and riders every summer. Most visitors don't know about Stacey Arras. There's no marker, no plaque, nothing to indicate that a girl vanished here decades ago. The trail she walked still winds through the forest, past the boulder where Gerald Stewart rested, toward the lake that glitters in the afternoon sun. It's beautiful country, peaceful and wild. But for those who know the story, there's something unsettling about the place. Something that makes you walk a little faster, look over your shoulder a little more often, stay on the trail no matter how tempting it might be to step aside for a photograph. In 2015, a journalist researching unsolved disappearances in national parks obtained access to some of Gerald Stewart's personal effects that his widow had donated to a local historical society after her own death. Among his belongings was a journal, most of it filled with mundane notes about his daily life. But there were 3 pages that had been carefully cut out. The cuts were clean, deliberate, not the ragged tiers of pages hastily removed. Whoever had cut those pages out had done so with scissors or a knife, taking care to remove them completely. The missing pages corresponded to late July 1981. The journal entry before the removed pages was dated July 24th. The next entry was dated August 2nd. Whatever Gerald had written about the days surrounding Stacy's disappearance, he or someone else had ensured it would never be read. This discovery reignited interest in the case briefly, but without the pages themselves, it proved nothing. Gerald's widow had passed away in 2001, taking with her any knowledge of what her husband might have written or destroyed, and Gerald's children had no information to offer. They barely remembered their father talking about the Yosemite trip, though they knew it had troubled him deeply. One daughter recalled her father saying something strange in the weeks before his death. Some things that happen in the wilderness should stay in the wilderness. She'd thought he was being philosophical, perhaps reflecting on mortality and nature. But after learning about the missing journal pages, she wondered if he'd meant something else entirely. The most chilling development in the case came in 2019, when advances in DNA technology allowed forensic teams to re-examine evidence from several cold cases. A research team reached out to Yosemite requesting access to any physical evidence from the Stacey Arras investigation. Rangers located the lens cap that had been found in 1981, preserved in an evidence locker. Testing revealed something unexpected. In addition to Stacy's DNA, which was confirmed through comparison with her family, there were trace amounts of DNA from an unknown male. The DNA was degraded, incomplete, insufficient for a database match, but it proved that someone else had handled that lens cap, someone whose identity remained unknown. This discovery raised new questions. Had someone else held Stacy's lens cap? Had they removed it from her camera? Or had they simply picked it up after finding it on the ground? Without more context, the DNA evidence created more confusion than clarity. But it did suggest one thing. Stacy had not been alone in her final moments. Someone else had been there, close enough to touch her camera or its components. Someone who had never come forward, never identified themselves, never told anyone what they'd seen or done. For investigators, this was the first tangible evidence in nearly 40 years that someone else knew the truth about what happened to Stacey Arras. But truth can be elusive in wilderness disappearances. Without a body, without witnesses, without a clear timeline, the best investigators can do is construct theories based on limited evidence. And every theory about Stacy's case has problems. The abduction theory requires a predator to have been in exactly the right place at exactly the right time, to have subdued a healthy teenager without making a sound, and to have transported her away without leaving tracks or scent trails. The accident theory requires her to have fallen or become injured in a way that put her completely out of sight, despite extensive aerial and ground searches. The voluntary disappearance theory requires elaborate planning from a girl who showed no signs of wanting to run away and left behind everything she owned. So what really happened on July 25th, 1981? The truth may be simpler and more horrifying than any theory. Perhaps Stacy encountered someone on that trail, someone who saw an opportunity and took it. Perhaps it happened in those 12 seconds when she walked through the blind spot, out of sight of the camp and Gerald's boulder. Perhaps it was quick and quiet. Perhaps she was threatened into silence. Perhaps she was too shocked to scream. And perhaps whoever took her knew the terrain well enough to vanish with her, to use the wilderness itself as a hiding place. National parks are vast. Yosemite alone covers nearly 750,000 acres. Much of it is rugged, remote, rarely visited. A person determined to hide something could find 1,000 places no searcher would ever look. George Arras died believing his daughter was murdered, taken by someone evil who had escaped justice. He died believing that if he'd just said yes, if he'd walked with Stacy to the lake, she would still be alive. He died with those words echoing in his mind, "If only I had gone with her." But the truth is that George couldn't have known. None of them could have known. Evil doesn't announce itself. It doesn't send warnings. It simply waits for opportunity and strikes when the moment comes. Stacy's moment came on a beautiful summer afternoon in one of the most spectacular places on Earth. And in that moment, she disappeared from the world, leaving behind only questions, grief, and a camera lens cap lying in the dirt. Today, if you visit Sunrise High Sierra Camp, you can still walk the trail Stacy took. You can stand at the spot where Gerald sat on his boulder. You can look at the tree line where her lens cap was found. The forest looks the same as it did in 1981. The lake still glitters with the same beauty that attracted Stacy's photographer's eye. But something has changed. The place carries a weight now, a sense of loss. Park rangers who know the story say they feel it, especially in the late afternoon when the light is golden and the shadows are long. They feel like they're being watched. They feel like the forest is keeping a secret. And they walk a little faster past that blind spot on the trail, the 20 feet where a girl vanished and took the truth with her. Stacy Ann Arras would be 57 years old now if she's still alive, but almost don't believe she is. Too much time has passed. Too much searching has yielded nothing. The most likely scenario is that she died within hours of her disappearance, that her body lies somewhere in Yosemite's wilderness, perhaps in a location no human has visited before or since. Or perhaps she was taken farther away beyond the park boundaries, to a fate no one wants to imagine. Either way, she's gone, and the only person who knows what happened is the person whose DNA was on that lens cap, the person who has kept silent for more than 40 years, the person who walks free while a father died tormented by guilt and a family remains fractured by loss. The case remains open. Technically, it will never close until Stacy is found or until evidence conclusively proves what happened to her. But realistically, after more than 4 decades, the chances of a resolution are nearly zero. The witnesses are dead or elderly. The physical evidence is minimal and degraded. The landscape has changed, altered by fires and floods in the simple passage of time. Whatever secrets the forest held in 1981, it had buried them deeper with every passing year. Stacy Arras has become a ghost story, a cautionary tale, a mystery that defines the dark side of wilderness beauty. She walked into the forest and never walked out. And somewhere between a campsite and a boulder 100 yards away, in a space that should have been safe and visible and impossible to vanish from, she ceased to exist. That impossibility is what haunts everyone who encounters this case. Because if Stacy could disappear so completely, so quickly, from a place with so many nearby witnesses, then nowhere is truly safe. Then any of us could take a walk and never return. Then the wilderness is not just beautiful and peaceful, but concealing and dangerous in ways we cannot predict or prevent. 43 years have passed since Stacy Ann Arras walked down that trail. 43 years of searching, questioning, theorizing, and grieving. 43 years during which she has not been seen, has not contacted anyone, has left no trace beyond a single camera lens cap and some degraded DNA. The probability that she is still alive is effectively zero. The probability that her body will ever be found is only slightly higher. This case, like so many others, will likely remain unsolved forever, a permanent gap in the historical record, a question mark where there should be answers. But Stacy Arras matters. She was a real person, not just a mystery. She had interests and dreams and relationships. She loved photography and horseback riding. She was kind to elderly strangers like Gerald Stewart. She was responsible enough that her father trusted her to walk alone. She was excited about capturing the golden hour light on a mountain lake. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, and she deserved better than what happened to her on July 25th, 1981. She deserved to grow up, to fall in love, to pursue her photography, to live a full life. Instead, she got 7 minutes of terror or confusion or pain we can only imagine, and then nothing. Erased from existence in a place that should have been safe, in circumstances that should have been impossible. Her story serves as a reminder that the wilderness, for all its beauty, is fundamentally indifferent to human life. It doesn't care about our plans or our innocence or our potential. It contains wonders and horrors in equal measure, and sometimes those horrors manifest in ways we cannot predict or prevent. Stacy's disappearance wasn't the result of carelessness or poor judgment. It was the result of terrible chance, being in the wrong place at the wrong time, crossing paths with something or someone malevolent and paying the ultimate price. If you visit Yosemite today and hike to Sunrise High Sierra Camp, take a moment on that trail. Think about Stacy. Think about her father's last words to her, his insistence on better boots, his lifetime of regret. Think about Gerald Stewart, whatever he saw or knew or did, taking his secrets to the grave. Think about the searchers who tried so hard to find her, who left no stone unturned but still came up empty. Think about the family that never got answers, never got a closure, never got justice. And then if you're wise, you'll stay on the trail. You'll keep your companions close. You'll trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Because Stacy's story teaches us that disappearances don't only happen to the careless or the reckless. They happen to smart, capable people who did everything right. And when they happen, they leave behind a devastation that never truly heals, a wound that remains open across decades, and questions that echo forever through the forest where answers refuse to grow.